it's Sandra Mazzilli here from Inner Action Counselling. Visit www.inneractioncounselling.co.uk. Notice the two L's in counselling because that's how we spell it here in the UK, where I live and work and help clients seeking therapy. The following is a live recording of a presentation I gave to the American Council of the Blind, ACB, and cameras remained off. That's why I was able to edit this file myself, and I'm using YouTube's own subtitling software, so massive apologies for any mistakes it is bound to make. For my visual content, I can't edit or subtitle the files myself because it's a sighted endeavour and I pay rather a lot for that, which is why when I can edit something myself, I take every opportunity. Now, because this presentation was given to an American audience, there are references to how therapists are trained and licensed in the United States. The rest of the content, about 98%, will be relevant to you wherever you are in the world. I called it Therapists Behaving Badly because a lot of therapists do behave very badly in our industry, and I'm going to cover various topics, including how to spot bad behaviour and what to do when you're mistreated. The complaints procedure I lay out is relevant in the United States, but it's not vastly dissimilar in the UK, and I'll make a shorter video about how to complain in the UK another time. Enjoy the presentation. Thank you very much. It's the top of the hour, so welcome everyone to this session of Mind Your Mind. It's been a long time coming back. I know I've been away for a long time. So this is called Therapists Behaving Badly. My name is Sandra. I'm the facilitator. I wanted to give this talk because there are instances of bad practice in therapy. So just a check that I'm using the term therapy to cover counselling and psychotherapy. So there's lots of instances of it happening. And some have come to my own attention and they irritate me because I and a lot of others work very hard to get it right for our clients. So I'm a qualified therapist, but people who do behave badly in the industry are not only damaging their reputations, but they are tarnishing the whole notion of therapy for others. Because if you think about it, if you eat at a restaurant and get bad service and it's bad food and awful things, you don't then write off restaurants. You just say, oh, I'm never going there again. You don't just say, right, all restaurants are bad, or I'm never eating food again. But that is what we do when therapy goes bad. We write off therapy as a whole. So that's why I wanted to do this, so that people know what is bad behavior and what isn't. And I'm using a slightly fun title for this because I don't really want to use words like malpractice, because that's quite hard to prove, which is why I've sort of done the whole, behaving badly, because some people do behave very badly. And there's a whole spectrum of things where it's just really shoddy practice and maybe sloppy behaviors. So I'm going to cover a spectrum of things. I'm going to talk about what to expect. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about what goes wrong, but what should actually go right. And then how to spot bad behaviors when it's happening, because some of the obvious things we know, but the ones that we don't know, the more subtle things. And then what to do if you've been mistreated. So the presentation part of our session will be posted on my YouTube channel, just the bit where I'm yakking, not the questions, comments, observation bit. That's just us, okay? The entire recording will be on the Clubhouse replay, so keep personal sharing to a minimum and keep personal details out as much as possible. You will be muted if the team feels that you're going beyond that brief. So that's the duty of care kicking in. Right, so before we untangle what should or shouldn't happen, let's try to define what we mean by the term therapy. So as I said earlier, I'm using that term as a catch-all for counselling and psychotherapy. So the Oxford Dictionary says therapy is the treatment of mental health conditions by verbal communication and interaction. The APA, so that's the American Psychological Association, says therapy is any psychological service provided by a trained professional that primarily uses forms of communication and interaction to assess, diagnose, and treat dysfunctional emotional reactions and ways of thinking.
and dysfunctional patterns. And then it talks about how it can be conducted with individuals, families, couples, or in groups. I, as a fully qualified and experienced therapist, think that it's the therapist's job to provide a safe, collaborative space. I don't really like the word treatment because it's a bit I unto you and do as I say sort of thing. It's more collaborative than that, working together so that the client and the therapist can do precisely that, work together to help that client with whatever is troubling them mentally, emotionally, dare I say it, spiritually. And it's interaction-based activity. So note that comment, interaction-based activity. Nobody but nobody should be doing things to you. So whether we are talking, writing, drawing, jumping up and down, I like blowing bubbles with my clients because it's kind of calming and so on. If it's play therapy, then, we're playing with toys. If you're expressing yourself with an instrument or multiple instruments, if it's music therapy, whatever it is, nobody but nobody should be doing anything to you. Now, where lines get blurred is if your therapist is qualified in related disciplines. So there is such a thing as yoga therapy and massage therapy, and you're sort of massaged and share your problems at the same time. That's as suspect as it sounds. I'm not giving that the time of day. In all seriousness, though, you may be seeing a psychiatrist, for example, who does have diagnosis and prescribing powers as a medical doctor, but maybe they're seeing you for psychotherapy, and they might decide to put their medical hat back on and think that, intravenous injections or pill-based drug regime will help you. That's not therapy anymore. They might refer to it as that. They might even call it drug therapy, but it's not therapy. It's not psychotherapy as defined above earlier, vis-a-vis treatment of mental health conditions by verbal communication and interaction. Right? Injections and things, that's something else. Right? Touching you, that's something else. We know conversion therapy happens. So that's if somebody is LGBTQ+ and certain therapists believe they can alter that so that you are attracted to the opposite sex. We all know that shouldn't happen. End of discussion about that. We've talked about what should be happening in terms of talking. Even in psychosexual services and therapies, there shouldn't be any things happening, as in encouragement to disrobe or any weird stuff like that. It really should just be talking about what your issues are and how to help you move forward. That's not to say you won't be doing interesting activities between sessions with your partner or partners, but in the actual session, talking only. So we've talked quite a bit about what should happen. Let's look at some of the things that should not happen. And we'll start with the most obvious first and move to the subtler ones a bit later on. So unsafe premises, we know that shouldn't happen. In person, let's say a rickety staircase or door handle hanging off. And the sort of virtual equivalent of the sort of weird premises is, let's say a therapist offers you virtual. This happened to me once, I kid you not. They offered phone sessions and the signal was dire. I heard every other word. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry, it's a terrible signal at my house. Why are you offering that then? That's just shoddy. Behaving irresponsibly with your data. This happened to me as well. Goodness. Right, so let's say they have your notes or they have your contract. So therapy should start with a contract or registration form or intake process of some kind, where you are fully apprised of what to expect from this person. Let's say how many sessions you have, or if it's open-ended, but how long a session will be or how much it costs. Even if it's through insurance, you should be aware of that kind of thing. And then what sorts of activities will be taking place, limits to confidentiality, all those sorts of things should be in the contract that you have read and possibly signed. So that person is responsible for that, And as we're talking in America, we're talking about HIPAA compliance. In the UK, that is known as General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. So same thing. Not exactly the same legally, but there's a similar principle. So they must be HIPAA compliant. They must keep your notes, your contract, any data they hold about you must be stored securely. If they are not doing that, that is not best practice. So if it's not locked away in a filing cabinet, or if they're paperless, password protected, or encrypted files in some form of safe, secure place, then that's poor practice. I had an instance where I was having personal therapy as part of my training, which is compulsory in various courses. But a therapist I was working with had my contract, and instead of giving a blank contract to somebody else, they gave my fully signed contract with my details, including next of kin, to somebody else. And I mentioned this later on in a training session. Oh, did you report that to so-and-so, as in the Information Commissioner's office? So in America, that would be the State Licensing Board. Did you report that? So, no, should I have? I should have. And your therapist, whoever you're working with, should be able to answer questions about all these things. How do you store your data? And what's going to happen to the information I give you? If they can't or won't answer you, that's a question mark and a pause for thought, isn't it? Being cagey about their qualifications and/or insurance. And this could go one of multiple ways. Either they will flatly say that they won't answer that, or they're not at liberty to, which is absolute rubbish. That is not a trade secret. They might say that it's too complex for you, which again is rubbish. If you've sought them out, because there's lots of therapists to pick from, and if you have the skill to discern between this one and that one and your needs and whether they suit you, then you have the skill to discern whether their qualifications match your needs or not. They might prevaricate, as in reflect back about it. So what are your qualifications? What do you think they are? Or why would you like to know that? Or I'm wondering how it might help you to know that. Or drag it back to an instance of something awful when you were 2. That's not good enough. They should give you a straight answer about that. And again with the insurance. If they're not insured, well, at least they're honest about it. They should be insured. And the bare minimum really should be indemnity, malpractice, and especially if they're seeing you in person, but even if they're not, public liability. That's the minimum. Right, I should stop ranting. Other things which should not happen, we're still in the obvious list. Making a pass at you. You see all this in movies, or allowing you to express undying love for them and then just carrying on with therapy as if nothing's happened. It has happened. This is a big thing, and it really shouldn't be left unchecked. So that therapist, whether they're in love with you or think they are, or you think you're in love with them, best practice is to refer you on to somebody where that's not going to happen, because therapy can't work if you've got all this sort of conflicting feelings and desires and all that kind of thing. A decent therapist will try and work through this with you, whether it's on their side or your side. If it's on their side, they really have no business telling you that. They should work through it in personal therapy and get rid of that. If it's your side and you've told them about that, and if it's possible to move past it and work together, then great, but most of the time it isn't, and it's best to refer you on. And they should help you find somebody else. They shouldn't dump you and be like, well, we can't really do this together. They should help you find somebody who's suitable for you. Disrobing, as in taking clothes off or asking you to, we've already covered this a bit earlier. That shouldn't happen. As I said, even if you're having sex and couples therapy, that should not happen ever, 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 ever. Making promises they cannot keep. We've touched on confidentiality before. They need to be clear that there are limits to confidentiality and explain what those limits are. And this is all part of the contracting stage. So either the consultation that you have with them, or at the very latest, session 1. So if they're all kind of expansive, you can tell me anything at all and it will go no further. That is not true. There are some instances, so for example, in my own practice, and I talk a lot about this on my YouTube channel, if you are needing help, as in emergency help, and emergency services need to be called, you may or may not be in a position to call them yourself. If you can't or won't, I have to do that for you. And I will, because I'm a safety first kind of person. Diagnosing you, and this is an interesting one because this is the difference between therapists in the UK, where I live, and therapists in America, where you guys are at. Because in the UK, it's an unregulated profession. Anyone who likes can call themselves a therapist. That's why there are various ethical bodies around the country. I'm a member of two of them, where they have these safeguards in place. So if somebody is registered with these particular ethical bodies, so in my case, it's the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, BACP, and the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, NCPS. There's loads of them. I'm just picking them because I'm talking about myself. So in those instances, people registered with them, and there's different levels of registration, anywhere from student to senior something, 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 has to be insured. They have to be receiving supervision every month. They have to be doing all kinds of things. They have to have a minimum amount of training and contact hours and clinical hours and on and on and on. Back to America, where you guys are, psychotherapy, counseling are regulated titles. Nobody can just sort of, oh, I'll set up a psychotherapy practice. They have to have a degree, a master's. Some have PhDs, not all. And in my opinion, the only people who should be diagnosing you are either medical or like psychiatrists, psychologists. Some psychotherapists do that, and I personally think it should only be the ones with PhDs on, because even then people can mess this up. In the main, they really shouldn't be doing that. And if you are in therapy and you just feel like, well, you want to talk about your stuff, and then they end up diagnosing you and giving you a diagnosis you haven't asked for, you have every right to ask them why they've done that and go into some detail about how they arrived at this conclusion. And they should not shut you down for that. And if you disagree with them, you have every right to ask for help with someone else. Manipulation, we're going into the lesser obvious ones now with manipulation. So telling you about things that you haven't asked for, or diagnosing you, or insisting that certain things have happened to you, suppressed memories or something, or you've had interesting dreams, and they're forcing interpretations on you which feel really off. First of all, you can argue with them, and they should be able to take that, not just, well, don't you tell that, I'm telling you what you have to do. That's really not how therapy should work. We've seen far too many movies where it's like, oh, this is what's happening to you. Oh, I'm feeling this and I have that. Well, I'll tell you what this is. That's not therapy. Making you think things before you're ready, and making you do things before you're ready. And this is a thin line, because certain issues like anxiety disorders, for example, or OCD or fear-based issues will have a certain amount of stretching you beyond your comfort zone to help you grow. So when is it poor practice, and when is it just pushing you to reach your potential, and so on? Your therapist should work with you to assess, first of all, and then work out a plan, again, with you. No one should just be sort of doing things to you. And phrases like, do you trust me? That's a definite no. Because if they have to ask, then that's a bit weird, isn't it, really? But they should be able to go with it, and they should be able to know that when you are saying, this is enough, or you can't do certain things, let's say graded exposure, I'm using the sort of spiders analogy. So let's say you're scared of spiders, a graded exposure type thing might be talking about them for a bit, using line drawings. I know we're not sighted. Most of my clients are sighted. That's why I'm kind of going there. It's kind of talking about line drawings of spiders. And eventually, if the client is able to, holding a spider. Right, those game shows where you see people just literally sitting there talking on a couch and then having a spider dropped on them is not best practice. It's great TV, but it's not best practice in therapy. But making you feel like you don't have any choice in something when you absolutely do. It's like you have to move through this. I mean, sometimes people will say that in the moment. Yeah, the therapist's like, you have to move past this or you have to talk about this. You do not. I will repeat that. You do not. If you feel you're not ready for something, you know yourself best. You've lived with yourself the longest. They're with you an hour a week. Now, they know an awful lot, especially in your part of the world where they've got degrees and masters and PhDs and things. I'll say it again, they're with you an hour a week. So they know you less well than you know yourself. They might know a lot about you if you spent a lot of time together and telling them your stuff, and they may or may not have access to your medical records, but they don't know you as much as you know yourself. And if you feel that the therapeutic interactions you're having are making you feel worse, sometimes some of these practices make you feel worse before you feel better. But if you just feel that this is just a downward trajectory and a downward spiral, absolutely bring it up. If they refuse to talk about it, so let's say you have a therapist and they've told you you can talk about anything, and you want to talk about your relationship with them and how off it feels, or I don't feel like you're listening to me sometimes, and they shut you down, then that's, well, you can't talk about everything, can you? The relationship is off limits. That is also not best practice. But making you believe things is not best practice. You absolutely have choices in all of this. So diving deeper into this, encouragement versus coercion. So encouraging you to do things versus coercing you to do things. So again, talking about the graded exposure thing, we're talking about spiders. Okay. We're looking at line drawings of spiders. Okay. They should be doing kind of feelings check-ins and assessing your tolerance for certain activities rather than pushing on and on and on and on, like you see in reality shows where people are screaming or crying or vomiting or all sorts of things, and they're being forced to hold spiders or look at clowns or whatever it is, which is great TV, but not best practice. That's coercion. That is not encouraging you to stretch beyond your comfort zone so that you grow in moving past the painful thing. Encouraging dependency. We talk about healthy dependency. No one would argue that a baby is unhealthily dependent. And a lot of therapy modalities will see people once a week. Some forms, especially the more analytical, may see people twice or 3 times. But however many times it is, it will be contracted for. It won't just be suddenly, well, you've gone once a week. I think you should see me twice a week. Actually, I think you should see me every day. That's not best practice. Extending boundaries. So let's say your session is 50 minutes and one day you find yourself an hour and a half later after the session and it's an hour and a half. Suddenly you haven't pre-agreed that. Not best practice. Not allowing you to question things. We've touched on this a little bit. So the obvious ones is about them and their modalities, their insurance, their qualification, their certificates. I'm delighted to talk about that kind of thing. I've spent a lot of time and a lot of money on that. So anyone who asks me will know, probably more than they want to. But if the person you're working with is not allowing you to question things, or instead of just saying, I'm not answering that, or this isn't about me, it's about you, or reflecting that back and turning it into an issue with you, then that's not best practice either. Forcing interpretations on you, oh, that's denial, that is. There should be a healthy discussion, even debate with you. Talking about themselves and their lives. Some disclosures can be helpful. I say that very guardedly. I personally have a zero tolerance for it, but I can see how in some instances it might be helpful. So in sight loss counselling, for example, I will share with my clients that I'm a blind person as well. And I might even go into the fact that I was born sighted and lost my sight as a baby. I won't go on and on and on about myself. That's a very big difference from this scenario of client A. Oh, I was in my car the other day and this person ran out in front of me and I was really scared. And the therapist's like, oh, that's nothing. You want to know what happened to me? That's not good. It should be about the client, not about the therapist. I knew somebody who was working with a therapist, and that therapist was sending them photos of themselves while they were on holiday. That's not good. How is that anything to do with the client? Or talking about you in a derogatory way, or making you feel like you're their problem or something. So, I was thinking about you, my client, all weekend. How is that my problem? That's your problem. Get supervision and personal therapy. Talking about other clients. Now, sometimes I will do this in a very general way. Let's say a client has an issue with grief and they want to know their feelings are normal. Let's say feelings of sadness, confusion, shock, guilt, all those kinds of things. And I might say something like, yeah, I've had lots of clients who feel like that. That's very different from me, the client, talking about a distressing situation, and then the therapist said, oh yeah, I had a client in that circumstance and this is what they did and they fell over and this, that and the other. Not good. Inappropriate contact between sessions. So sending you inappropriate emails, texts, whatever it is. The only contact between sessions that should be happening is discussion about admin. So let's say I can't keep the appointment that we had, or you can't, then you'd write to me and we'd try and rearrange something like that. Or let's say you're working in person and the room has to change. This happens quite a bit in schools or schools counselling, where the school decides you're in one room this week and you're in a broom cupboard the next. Then it would be a good idea to let your client know ahead of time. That's the kind of thing that should be happening between sessions. Nothing else. Okay. Telling you what to do. I think we've covered that a little bit, but I'm going there again. Therapy works best when you come up with the answers yourself, not you coming to your therapist and them saying, well, you know what you should do? Or I tell you what you want. That's not therapy. We've already talked about how therapy is communication-based interaction. That's not communicating, that's just doing unto. And we already said that shouldn't happen. Presents. It's an interesting one. Because some people give like thank you notes or cards at the end, like at the end. We all have seen those films and TV shows where client or therapist have crossed the line there and have given somebody some sort of fabulously expensive gift. That's not a good idea. Blurring the lines, anything that blurs lines, because you're not friends, you're working together and it's a civil conversation, but it isn't a friendship. Sometimes it can feel a bit like that, but you don't pay your friends to sit and talk to you for an hour. So if you ever get confused, just go back to that. So even if you're working through insurance, somebody is paying for it, and that's not friends. Mismanagement of time. So we've covered that, an hour session turning into a 3 hours thing. That's very different if you're in crisis, then it could easily turn into that, and the police are involved and various other things. I mean, an ordinary session that you have pre-agreed is this amount of time, and it turns into something else. This works the opposite way, for example, if you're on time and they're like half an hour late and they haven't got a good reason for it. Turning up late, double booking themselves, they shouldn't really do that. There's lots of software. Calendly is one, but there's loads of them where they really shouldn't be doing that. Either they've got software or they've got a human assistant, whatever it is. If they're double booking themselves, you know, a one-off, these things happen. But multiple times, that's just shoddy. Allowing doorknob moments. So let's say it's 10 minutes till the end of the session, and you know that, they know that, or it might be even 5 minutes. And then you, the client, bring up something that really isn't a 5-minute issue. It's a very long discussion that's needed. So a good therapist will manage expectations around that. And we'll either talk about that next week or, you know, have an extra session if needed, but not just let you go on and on and on, because that can lead to dysregulations. Let's say you're sharing something horrible at the end. And I've been there myself personally and professionally, where you're kind of gearing up to say something and it's coming to the end. So the pressure's off, really. You know, you won't really get to discuss it. You just want to sort of leave it there. But then it causes you symptoms, so tearfulness or anger or some kind of explosive situation. There's no time for that therapist to help ground you and get you back into regulation again, because they have to dump you out the door because the time is up. You know, they should be managing that with you and giving you warnings and things, you know, in 10 minutes or in 5 minutes when you start thinking about wrapping up. I tend to ask my own clients how they're going to look after themselves after the session, and we might spend a few minutes talking about that. There should be nothing heavy at the end. Dysregulation going unchecked. So some therapists, in the name of not intervening, will get people to talk about horrible things, and those horrible things understandably cause horrible symptoms. So anxiety type symptoms, or cold sweat, or lots of tears, or just sobbing and flooding the place, or making the person feel absolutely terrified, and not doing anything about that, just allowing that to happen in the room and no intervention. Or worse, like we've just said a minute ago, getting somebody to talk about something utterly horrible at 5 minutes to the end, where there's no time to then pick that person up off the floor and be like, right, well, see you next week. That is abominable and should not happen. Working beyond your scope of competence. So, for example, like my specialisms are disability, OBS, grief, depression, anxiety, trauma, chronic pain. So if someone came to me and I decided to see them for eating disorders, which I'm not trained in, that would be really poor practice. So before I go on to complaints procedures, because I know you're probably bursting to hear about that, there are some times where nobody's doing anything wrong, but it just isn't working because the stars haven't aligned. And I don't mean it to sound as wishy-washy as that. So it could either be wrong time, right therapy, right therapist, wrong time, wrong therapy, right therapist, wrong time, wrong therapy, right therapist, right time, the sort of wrong messaging, right therapist, or when it all comes together and you've got the right therapist doing the right therapy at the right time. So sometimes people feel they are ready for something they are not. And the classic example is grief. I need to get over this. And they come into therapy and they're just not ready for it. And that's nobody's fault. And whatever the reason for the misalignment, it is never, ever, 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 ever the client's fault. It doesn't matter if they think it is. It doesn't matter if the therapist thinks it is. They really shouldn't. It is never your fault. Sometimes it's not the right person. Sometimes it is the right person and they're doing everything they ought to be doing, and it's just the wrong time for you because it's too soon. It's never too late, but it could easily be just too soon. Or there's too much other stuff going on. So an example of that would be abuse, whether that's emotional, physical, financial, sexual, domestic violence, and all those kinds of things. It's very hard to help someone move on from it if it's still happening. The best case scenario is the therapy doesn't do anything. And the worst is if it makes you actually feel worse, because you can't lean into discussing it all and getting to a point where you move on from it. If it's still going on, you still have to be kind of like a tense spring. And so you can't release stuff because it's not safe yet. So sometimes people might be doing an acceptable job and it's just the wrong moment. So as promised, the complaints procedure. Therapists are licensed by the state licensing board. So if you need to make a complaint, you do it through the board. I got some info from the California State Licensing Board, but really insert state, and then you will find out what happens. So in the broadest terms, because it will be the same, is you go to the website, you fill in a form. I was quite disappointed with the Californian one because it said, download this PDF and print it out. I thought that's not very fly friendly, but you can, there's various conversion tools to do that. So you go to the website, you download the form, reformat the form, fill in the form, and send it back to them. So there's an address and a web emailing thing. So depending on the severity of the nature of the complaint, this is where outcomes will diverge. If it's a minor complaint, there's no great impact on the therapist at the other end. We're talking stern letter, you know, that kind of thing. If it's severe, it's up before the board. There's an investigation, you'll be interviewed, they will be interviewed. If it needs to go beyond the board itself, so let's say the complaint is upheld, they will be treated severely. And the details of that will be sent back to you and will be sent back to that person. So if they're registered with the APA, so the American Psychological Association, or other association, they could be struck off that register. Being struck off registers like that won't ensure that they can't practice anymore. That's with the board. So if it goes beyond the board, we're looking at criminal proceedings, and we know how they work. So a quick roundup of a few interesting letters after people's names, because you can look this up if you are looking at different registers. So Psychology Today verifies their members. And there's various other directories like that. I just mentioned that because there's a version of it in the UK as well as the United States. So if people are verified through that, then you know that they have certain registrations in place. Anyone with the letter L is licensed. If they've got an AL, it's associate license. That's not a full license. So as I said earlier, degree, masters, some have PhDs, but not all. After the education part and the clinical hours and the heavy supervision, there's an associate licensure, so that's AL, and then a full license, L. So you'll see all sorts of things, L, MSW, LPC, L, da 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 da. L is license. LPC is licensed professional counselor. LMFT is licensed marriage and family therapist. So you see where it starts to pile up, because you might have an ALPC, which is an associate licensed professional counselor. So they are not a fully licensed person yet. Or an ALMFT. Starts to make more sense? Goody! So LCSW is a licensed clinical social worker. LMSW, means that the person is a licensed social worker and they have a master's in it. On and on and on. So that's a few different sorts of letters. So that is the end of the lecture part. If you are spending time with me on YouTube, thank you very much for sticking till the end with me. If you're here in the room live from this point on, it's time for your questions, comments, observations, and it is just us.